Howdy, of you delicious people. I'm here today to review a movie called Voyagers. I kind of really did enjoy this film after the fact that I started to realize at first that I'm like, oh my god, this is another space movie. Oh no. Am I going to enjoy this or is it going to bore me to death? What is going to go on here? But I ended up really actually enjoying this film. I was like surprised by how interesting it was. We end up having a tour. We end up having Colin Farrell's character Richard, who is to eventually decide to otherwise go with a bunch of much younger astronauts to go on a exploration to make it to some other Earth, and we realize that the trip of which that these people are going to go on to is of course a one-way trip because they are to have this travel this way about going things span 83 years of travel. So we end up having it to where we have to have astronauts who are very good at being isolated. So basically, we end up having characters who are basically born into isolation. We end up having these test tube like babies who are basically born into isolation and basically trained to become astronauts and to be trained to eventually become the next passing on of knowledge, because eventually they realize that 83 years of time would probably have these kids eventually have to make kids on this spaceship to eventually carry on the human race, quite possibly, if really Earth is doomed. So going on into this movie, I honestly really did enjoy it after I start to see the breakdown of the film and how things were being done. Really, we have just a lot of impressive young actors. Well, I say young, but we end up having a lot of these characters who seem to be young actors really actually are pretty much veterans. We end up having, of course, Ty Sheridan, who I have seen in Ready Player One, which is still to this day my most favorite film. We end up having Sella, who is Leela Rose Depp, who I have seen her in movies like Yoga Hosers or just kind of a number of things, probably here and there, and so on and so forth. Really, of course, you have Colin Farrell, which I think my favorite movie of him is actually the movie The Lobster, which is a very odd and bizarre film, but I just enjoy it because it's just weird and or odd. So, going on in this film, we end up having, of course, Colin Farrell's character Richard, who ends up deciding to want to go along with these young astronauts to basically kind of mentor them and to try to help them adjust to this environment, this scenario, and so on and so forth. We end up having it to where eventually it seems that the younger generation of these people eventually end up finding out things. They end up realizing that it seems that all isn't what it seems to be, and that they end up finding that a lot of these smarter-ish people are starting to realize that well, hey, what is going on in this spaceship? It seems that Richard especially is kind of holding back information from them. It kind of seems that also we end up having some people kind of eventually finding out things and then asking answers from Richard, and Richard is not giving them answers. So it's kind of a very interesting journey to this story where we are to try and understand what is going on within this film. How we are to try and have dissension like come within all these people, to where the point where eventually we end up having seemingly an arms race going on, where like people are so paranoid between one another, because we end up having certain characters also persuading people onto their side, and for them to eventually like it just basically boils down into a witch hunts at some point within this movie as well. Like it kind of gets really interesting, and like so much more interesting than like I thought it was going to be. I thought it was just going to be a normal space movie where I was just going to get bored to death about all like space knowledge and like how people have to sound really smart in this film. But no, it actually boils down to be something so much more different, and I actually really appreciate this film for that. We end up having Sella, who is again Lily Rose Depp, who is to eventually be the medical officer of this ship. We end up having eventually some characters here and there that are to be heads of engineering, and uh, and eventually there are some people, when eventually all heck breaks loose. We eventually have some people who are just thinking like, well, I should obviously be the leader now. Like I should be a leader. Like if anything, let's put it to a vote and let's see who really should be the leader out of all this. And then once they still do not get their way, they eventually still try to manipulate people and still try to get people on their side, and it becomes a very interesting story. And so with that said, I think that's all that I want to say about this movie, because really I really did enjoy this film. It was a big thumbs up for me, in all honesty, because I was thinking like, man, this story is just going to be like so boring and whichever, because I've kind of seen other movies where like it's either a lot of space stuff and it's a lot of technical stuff, and like I was assuming it's going to be that. I assumed or assessed that it wasn't going to have much of anything of real true interest, but then I started to see this and I'm like, man, if people like this kind of film, like shows like The 100 and Society and certain other kinds of other things, like eventually they'll really enjoy this show. So with that said, I think it's about that time to go into spoilers about this movie, because yeah, there isn't much to say about this in a very cryptic like sense, because really it just boils down as a space adventure that really does get really intriguing. So go ahead and check this out. Definitely, if you do not have some kind of way of which that you want to spend money upon this movie, which I can understand that. Really, there also is some free options to go out of your way to say that you've seen this film. Really, there have been stuff that I've recommended before, like a Movie Pro or a Play Ultra app that I think has gone and adjusted to look like a different app now. I think Movie Play or Movie Pro is actually C Movies now, like the letter C and then movies. And I think also Ultra Play might have changed, or Play Ultra movies might have actually changed the way that they look too. It has some like Fox kind of logo on it, bizarrely. But I think the name is kind of technically the same. So with that said, let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this movie. So if you've seen this movie, or if you just want to hear what I have to say about this film and like, oh wow, this is a very interesting movie, go ahead and check it out afterwards. So going in here, we end up having it to where we are to basically have kids having to forcibly be born to do this mission. basically we end up having a ton of test tube babies that are to be purposely created for this mission. So I'm like, so you're not even taking anybody from the actual Earth. You are having to create children for the specific purpose of sending them on this mission because they have to be young enough to be perfectly be able to go to this mission. So we end up having it to where we have uh, Richard, who is to go on to eventually have fun with these kids and mentor these kids and watch over them. And so we end up having Richard deciding, like, well, hey, like, I've spent so much time with these kids. How about I go there and how about I be their commander, their superior? Like, how would I mentor them through this transition? And plus, like, it'll be way easier for you guys to be able to launch much quicker than you would have if you have me on this mission. And so we end up having the people at within this place. They make the consensus like, well, okay, that seems like the right move. It seems like we trust. It seems like we trust Richard. Like, go ahead and go. So we end up having it to where Richard is to take on the command of this spaceship, this spacecraft, and whatever. Eventually, we are to be told that these kids that are on this ship are to eventually have kids because really this mission is 83 years in length. So, not everybody is going to live that long. So, we go on and we seemingly have a big to do about how exactly this mission is going to be laid out and so on and so forth. Having to have these kids born into isolation so that way they won't lose their minds or go crazy about it because that's all they've known. So we eventually have it to where Richard is to eventually give and show and help some of these younger characters just by mentoring them, almost like at some points being their therapist or their psychologist, really trying to help them understand why they should be doing what they're doing. We end up having at some point where we end up having people coming to Richard and kind of asking, it's like, well, why should I do what I do? And we end up having Richard who ends up explaining it in the most perfect way. We end up having Richard who shows a picture of his family and he's like, oh, okay, like, you know what? Like, I had parents and I had grandparents and why is it that you think that they eventually did this? Why do you think that eventually they had kids? Why do you think they eventually thought that they should be protecting their youngest? And we end up having a guy going, well, I don't know, like, I don't get it. And so because Richard says because it was the right thing to do, because of the thing that they needed to do. Like, and so we end up having that kind of analogy kind of going like, oh, okay, so I should be doing what I'm doing because it's the right thing to do, because it's like a thing that I should do, because it seems that reasonably it's the right path. So, or it's the path that has already been probably pre-chosen for a lot of people within this ship. So, like, they were basically bred or they were basically made to do what they were supposed to do, so why not just do it? So, going along into this journey, this path, we eventually end up having Christopher, who is Ty Sheridan's character, kind of starting to ask questions. It seems that eventually we have Christopher, who is to eventually uh, go on to find that there is some chemical within their urine, because it seems like everyone is using their urine to grow their plants. And so we end up having Christopher, who is noticing that there is some chemical within everyone's urine that doesn't quite make sense to him. So we end up having eventually Christopher trying to dissect what this chemical is, trying to understand exactly what it does. And eventually we end up understanding that it seems that uh, this chemical is a medication that is seemingly trying to medicate people to seemingly be less aggressive, seemingly be less uh, pheromonal, let's just say, being much more of a passionate human being, to where it really kind of just dulls a lot of senses. And so we end up eventually having it to where also Christopher eventually finds that there is some part of this ship that seems to have been hidden from everyone. And we end up having Christopher, who ends up realizing that, and he ends up bringing it up to Richard to just be like, okay, hey, like, why is it that like this room is like sealed off from everyone? And we have it to where Richard says, well, there's a whole reason behind that. Like, if anything, this equipment is actually for the next generation, the third generation of when you guys actually make it to the planet, you might need these resources. And so Christopher is like, huh, well then why wouldn't he tell me exactly what that is? So we eventually also have Christopher and Zach, who are completely stopping taking this blue liquid that they seem to keep on getting. They end up continually pouring it out, and it seems that both Zach and Christopher end up becoming a lot more aggressive, to the point of them wanting to wrestle one another. Eventually, we end up having Zach, who seems to be fairly interested in Sella's character, and we end up having Zach trying to express his emotions of of uh, love or romance or something like that in a very awkward way. We end up having Zach, who is like basically just touching up on all of Sella, and Sella does not like it. We end up having Zach, who ends up trying to like hug her and like bring her in, and Sella does not like that at all. And so we eventually have it to where Richard is to confront, because he is noticing what is going on. And so we have to where Richard goes to Sella and he's like, well, like, are you okay? Like, are things like, what did Zach do? And so we end up eventually having Richard trying to confront Zach, but Zach ends up running off to eventually, uh, Richard ends up uh, finding out that it seems that Zach had stopped taking the blue liquid that they have been given. And we eventually also have Richard find out that Christopher has also stopped taking the blue liquid, because they should have been able to have the choice to take this medication or not, instead of just being force fed it to them for however long. So we end up having a lot of like real dissension in here. But also we end up having it to where before this, we end up having also that Zach was putting his hand on Sella's shoulder, to where we end up having Richard, who is to tell Zach, hey, quit with the touching. Like, no, do not touch one another. Like, that's wrong. And so that leads to eventually Zach seeing Sella uh, and Richard talking about things in his office, and uh, like he's kind of giving her some kind of things for her to smell, and then also he's kind of giving her some kind of reports and stuff like that. And Richard ends up touching Sella on the shoulder, and we end up having Zach going like, "Well, why is it that Richard can touch Sella on the shoulder, but I can't? What is the difference?" So that's when we have Zach, who escalates him and Zelda's touching even further, to just be like, well, like, I want this girl, this is what I want, so I'm going to make it seem, or I'm going to make it sure that Sella also knows that. But we end up having it to where Sella is just uncomfortable around Zach, and she ends up pushing him away, which again has Richard chasing after him to just be like, well, why did you do that? Like, why did you touch her? But we end up having Richard going like, well, I'm not going to chase after Zach all day. We have much more pressing matters. We have it to where it seems like they keep hearing a sound somewhere in the ship, somewhere on the ship. And so immediately we end up having it to where Richard is continually confirming to all of the crew members that, hey, it's just the ship, it's just ship sounds, like it's nothing. And we end up having people going like, no, I think it's something else. Like, I think it's something alien. I think it's whatever. I think it's this and that. And we end up having Richard who's like, come on. Like, no, it's just the ship. It's an old ship. It's been out in the space for a number of years. I was almost going to say out to sea, but that's the same thing. Like, this thing has been out for a many of year now, and so really the ship is going to make sounds. It's just the way it is. So we end up having Richard and Christopher going outside of the ship, putting on spacesuits, and going out to the ship to fix a part of the ship. And so we end up having seemingly that both Christopher and Richard, I guess there are cameras outside of the ship, bizarrely. Like, that's kind of weird, but it is what it is. We end up having a camera footage of what is going on between Christopher and Richard kind of doing their tasks. So we end up having Richard and Christopher making their way to this thing to try and fix it. And then it seems that also there seems to be some bizarrish, blackish looking cloud outside with them in space. And so we end up bizarrely having there being some kind of electrical malfunction, which ends up all of a sudden bizarrely burning or kind of killing half of Richard's body. And so we end up having Christopher scrambling to get Richard back into the ship to have them try to revive him. And sadly enough, this experiment goes horribly awry. Or this experiment, this fixing of things ends up just kind of costing Richard his life. So we end up having Sella, who is to date and time and mention that, okay, well, Richard is dead. We just have to move on. So they end up having to forcibly need to vote for a new leader. And so everyone ends up casting ballots. And really, we end up having Zach, who is, of course, saying that, well, I'm going to throw my hat in the ring of being the leader of this. And we end up having certain people trying to, like, politic their way into being leader. But really, we just end up having the leader eventually just being Christopher, because it seems that he seems to be, like, number two out of everybody else. So we have it to where Christopher instantly becomes a leader, and everybody, for the most point, is happy about that, with the exclusion of course, Zach, of just going like, well, like, I don't care that really Christopher is leader. I'm going to pretty much manipulate people and get my way anyways. So we eventually have it to where we go along in this story and we just start having a lot of the other younger, a lot of the people on this ship, because they're all the same age now, because Richard is now dead. He was the oldest on the ship. And so now we start to have people who are starting to be more um, who are starting to be more aroused of sorts. And we also have it to where people are starting to bump and grind with one another. And a lot of people are starting to run around the ship a lot more. And some people are much more wrestling one another. And we end up having it to where eventually we are starting to have people just kind of walk around on the ship to see in some room somewhere two people just going at it within this ship. And it's like, what the heck is going on? Like, come on, like right in front of the right in not in their own separate room. It's basically just in some gym somewhere. They're just going at it. We end up having at some point Zach going and touching one of the girls' faces and eventually like putting his thumb in her mouth and like being very like romantic, if I could. It's not exactly how it's kind of like, you know how it is with the young hormones and stuff. The hormones of it all are kicking in. So we eventually have it be that we really have Christopher, who is telling people that they need to really fix the surveillance. And that seems to be the number one thing that they need to do. And so we at first have a bunch of people doing what Christopher is saying, fixing their surveillance. And then eventually we end up having them like stopping doing their job. And we end up having Christopher going like, well, wait a minute, like you guys should have been like really been working on like the surveillance part of this ship, because we only end up having one person working on it. And so we end up having all of the people all in the food area. And so we end up having Christopher was like, God, why aren't you guys all working on surveillance instead of food? And so Zach says, well, because we had a fridge problem and we all just decided that we're all just going to work on food instead of working on surveillance. And we all have to now go and do a food party because it seems like some of the food is going to go spoiled. So let's have a party for Christopher uh, being the new leader. And really, in all honesty, I think there was a big lie of Zach. I think really what they were actually doing was just doing whatever Zach wanted, and Zach is wanting to much more take control and say that there are reasons for their doing what they're doing, and they can kind of do whatever they want. And everybody is kind of getting much more accepting to that than Christopher ordering people around. So eventually, once they have their party, they start to realize that more and more, or Christopher is starting to realize that people are still jerking their chores, and so we end up having Christopher having to confront the people about it and just be like, hey guys, like, get to work. Like, why aren't you guys all working? And we end up eventually having it to where Zach is like, well, you know what? Like, what does it even matter if we actually do our chores or not? We're not even going to live through this entire mission. What is the point of us even doing what we're doing? Because eventually we're going to outlive this ship. We are eventually going to outlive this mission. What difference does it make? We end up having a bunch of people kind of saying that. And so Christopher is telling him, it's like, well, it's the right thing to do. Like, it's going to help us survive. like basically if one thing ends up falling, everything is going to fall, and then it's just anarchy and chaos, and then eventually the ship is just going to fall apart. So we end up eventually just saying, like, well, Zach is still trying to politic his way into becoming, like, the new leader. We end up having Zach, who is just like, well, you know what? How about this? Like, how about, like, I go and I make my own side of the ship, and, like, I have people come along with me, because I think that uh, that there quite possibly is an alien or something going on into the ship. That's why Richard had died. And so, like, I'm going to try to, like, get people onto my side because I wanted to become leader anyways. And now, so we end up eventually having surveillance footage of exactly what had happened. Eventually, we end up having Christopher and a bunch of his people starting to realize why they tried to avoid fixing the surveillance. And so we end up having Christopher fixing up their surveillance. And it seems that also that Zach and I believe Kai tried to break the surveillance, but it was too late because Christopher and a lot of the people end up getting footage to realize why they had tried to break the surveillance. It's coincidence that Zach and Kai tried to go and break the surveillance, and there's a whole reason behind that. So we end up having seemingly everybody is kind of behind Zach now, because this whole like conspiracy of there being an alien, and so we end up having Zach, who is to give us the true verdict of whether or not Richard had died via an alien or some other kind of malfunction of sorts. And so we end up having Christopher, who is delivering footage to the entire group to showcase what had really happened. So we end up having footage of Christopher showing Zach and Kai in the surveillance bay, and we end up seeing Richard and Christopher doing their job. So we have it to where the entire time in this footage, we have Zach and Kai who are plotting to kill Richard and to try to electrocute him, and it's obviously going through the tape, where we end up having Zach, who is obviously trying to kill Richard because of jealousy, of something as simple as jealousy that had turned Zach into wanting to kill off Richard because he wasn't getting the woman that he wanted. Interesting. So we have Christopher, who relays the footage to the entire group, telling the people, okay, well, Zach is obviously a murderer. And Zach is like, well, like, you know what? Like, I killed Richard because he was an alien. And you know what? I think that also there could be other people in here that are aliens as well. You never know. The alien that was in Richard could go into other bodies. And all of a sudden we have Zach, who is trying to choose sides and trying to tell of anybody that seems to not exactly be on Zach's side, that maybe they could be an alien, or they could be an alien, or they could be an alien. And so all of a sudden we end up having Zach and Kai, who are putting together this witch hunt to just say, well, like, somebody has to be an alien on this ship, and I think it might be Zach. I think it might be Christopher. I think it might be Sella. I think it might be any number of these people. And so we end up having everybody starting to choose sides now, and we end up having a bunch of people running away and running off to hide I don't know where, because there's nowhere to hide on a spaceship. We eventually end up having certain kids and or characters who ended up wrestling with one another. Eventually, somewhere down the line, they are starting to get accused of being a alien just because we have some people trying to settle scores where Kai is accusing some other guy of being an alien because he had tried to basically get with his woman, and they ended up fighting it out after that. So we end up having Zach, who ends up accusing this guy of being an alien. He starts to run off, and so they end up kicking him and beating him to a bloody pulp, and he dies. And so we end up now having a witch hunt going on. We end up having Sella, who for the longest time does not feel safe, to the point of her having a scalpel off to the side of her, off to the side of her to there's just an arms race just becoming upon the ship, and Sella is just like the first one to just be like, dude, like I'm not taking chances, like I'm not gonna risk myself because I am going to be outnumbered or whatever. I'm just gonna knife a man if I have to. So we go along and we end up having Christopher, and we end up having Sella, and we end up having two other people that are just like that are running off to go into their own rooms and just like, dude, what do we do? Like, should we just give in and work with Zach so that way it doesn't seem like we're aliens even though we're really not? Like, should we try to just like give in and just give up, and because there's nowhere to hide. We're in a spaceship. So we end up having two of the people that Christopher and Sella were with ending up giving up themselves to Zach to work with Zach because it's just a numbers game at this point. So we end up having it to where Christopher and Sella realize, well, hey, like, we are going to sneak around into this ship until eventually they are trying to find us. And eventually we also have it to where Sella is reminding Christopher that he's the only one that knows of this hidden compartment that's in the ship. And so we end up having Christopher, who is to go into this hidden compartment because Sella told him that that whole entire compartment was filled with guns for them to use. And so we end up having Christopher trying to sneak into this compartment and trying to unlock this combination like door, and he ends up failing at it. But while he is to try and unlock this combinational thing, we end up having people all of a sudden hearing what is going on through the walls. And so we end up having people hearing what is going on, and so they send Zach and his army out to figure out what the heck that this is. So they end up bursting through this compartment to eventually go on to use tools to be able to open up this door. And so they end up eventually realizing that there is a bunch of guns through this door. And so we end up now having people being armed. So we end up having a Zach eventually shooting any number of people, like whoever is to kind of put up an argument against Zach, whoever is to try and rationalize all this to any number of other people, basically just ends up either accidentally or on purpose just getting shot. We end up having one girl who seems to honestly be like hated by the entire group to the point of them all wanting to tell her to just shut up because they're tired of her crap. Um, like they just all hate her and they want her to just go away. So we end up having this girl who is trying to justify to them that going into an arms race, going in with guns, like just seems just insane, which it technically is. And so we end up having one guy ending up shooting this girl down just because. And so we eventually end up seeing that Christopher and Sella are starting to realize that, dude, we are so toast. Like, anybody who's going to have any argument against Zach is going to die. So we have Christopher and Sella running through this entire ship to eventually have Zach trying to hunt them down and even try to shoot them down, and they end up failing. And so we eventually have both Christopher and Sella decide, like, well, hey, we need to kill Zach somehow. Like, this guy needs to go away. And so they're just trying to, like, go, like, well, there's nowhere else to go. So how about we go into our space jumpsuits and go outside of the ship? Because that might be a way that we can conveniently have a much more safe distance from Zach and his people. And so we end up having both Christopher and Sella getting into their spacesuits. And so we end up having Zach, who is to realize that both Christopher and Sella had blocked the window, obviously telling him that they are in there hiding out. So we end up having Zach, who is to open this door to eventually realize that both Christopher and Sella had opened the door of this room and also opened up the airlock to this room. And so we end up having Zach, who immediately, once opening this room, ends up getting sucked almost out of space, or out onto space almost. And so we end up having Zach, who is like hanging on to dear life. We end up even having Christopher, who ends up almost falling into the through the airlock himself. He ends up grabbing onto Zach's shirt and ends up like ripping his entire shirt. And so we end up having Zach, who eventually ends up getting like sucked through this like sucked into space. And we end up having Christopher, who had gotten sucked out of space, or into space. And so we end up having Christopher, who we are to assume or assess is now lost, who is just as dead as Zach is. And so we end up having Sella, who ends up finally closing up the door to try and prevent this airlock. And we eventually end up seeing Christopher, who had just been able to grab onto the ship just in time to be able to save himself from going off into endless space. So we have Scylla, who ends up regathering Christopher, of course, and so now we end up having a drastic change of which that they go into the order of how to do things. And so we end up having them all decide, well, hey, man, like, we are going to go in here and we are going to decide together, because they basically killed off all the real villainous people that were trying to like manipulate people and sway people onto their side, and the numbers game and whatever. Once we end up having Christopher and Sella also killing Kai, because they ended up kind of using like a like some kind of like fire extinguisher looking thing to like hit Kai onto the head. And we end up having eventually them figuring out how to subdue Kai and knock him out and eventually kill him. Eventually they went off to get to Zach, and then like they had to like a perfect order of things. So we end up having Christopher and Sella coming back to all the rest of the people, where they're basically not going to kill Christopher and Sella off. Like, I think reasonably they were very much undecided at some point. When eventually Christopher and Sella ends up killing Kai, we end up having Christopher, who ends up like having a gun out and we end up having people kind of rushing in to go after both Christopher and Sella, but they end up kind of just backing away because they're like, you know what, like he's down, so like we can just kind of like just say that we're continually looking, even though that's not really what we're doing. So we have it to where Christopher and Sella come back, and they are kind of just accepted by the group. So we end up having it to where now they have to vote on everything. We end up having it to where there is a real true, like, every vote counts. And so we end up having it to where they end up trying to uh, revote to have a new leader. And so we also end up having it to where they kind of vote on everything. So I'm assuming they probably end up having to all vote on chores and all kinds of other things. So everybody seems to be much more happier. So we are now going to have a montage of eventually like showcasing that eventually this spaceship is to live on, that eventually people are to start to get older, and eventually a lot of people are to start to get pregnant. We end up having Sella, who also is eventually going to be pregnant and have a child, and eventually we see her having her child being delivered, and so on and so forth. So we eventually end up like showcasing the lifespan of all these people and eventually them all getting older. Yeah, they don't actually get older, they just kind of get CGI'd older, which it looks really goofy. But we end up keep like showing like spans upon spans of days where eventually we end up seeing these people eventually get older over time, and eventually we end up seeing that these people are to eventually make it to this planet, and we have them kind of poking all their heads outside this door to eventually see that they have made it to this new planet. And luckily, I guess for them, that they had been able to just work things out. So, yeah, really, we end up having it to where, because it was kind of funny because Sella was actually supposed to delete and destroy all of Richard's videos and footage and whatever, and we end up having them instead keeping all this video footage to repetitiously watch over and over and over again, so that they can kind of like keep logs and stuff of and learn things. And we end up having also Richard had a lot of home videos, a lot of home tape, and so we end up having seemingly Sella and Christopher watching those, and eventually while they are to eventually like start watching those together and spend so much time together, they are to eventually start holding hands and hugging and kissing and whatever, to where eventually we end up having Zach, who at some point ends up realizing that Christopher is trying to get what was his woman, to where eventually when Sella ends up giving herself up to Zach to try to just say like, well, like Sella was like, well, hey, like Zach, this one's for you, like I'm for you now. We end up having Zach who's like, dude, I don't want you, like maybe someone else will, but I don't. To where they try to like because Christopher and Sella was trying at some point to just be like, man, we need to kill Zach, like we need to chop off this head, so that way like this whole manipulation alien thing just stops, and so we can go back to normal because everybody will just conform and whatever. We have it to where the only person that is really causing a problem here is Zach, and so we have to figure out how to kill him off. And so they ended up killing him off, but it was kind of technically a little bit also just too late, to where people end up dying along the way. So we go along here, and we also had we also eventually had it to where I think the most interesting moment in this movie that I kind of skipped around about is we end up having Zach, who had started to take control of this group and started to take control of everything. And we end up having Christopher, who is realizing that it seems that Zach is on his way. Now that he has seemingly control of the ship, he is going to try and um, take control of Sella one way or the other. And so we end up having Christopher running to get to Sella to try and stake claim on this woman by touching on her and hugging her, to where Sella is just kind of throwing Christopher off, literally, because she is just like, "What are you doing?" And we end up having it to where Zach is like, "Oh, well, like, you act fast." And then Zach ends up leaving. And so Sella's like, "Why did you do that for?" Like you're just like Zach. And Christopher's like, "No, like I tried to do that to keep you safe, to just say that like that you are mine, so that way he doesn't come after you, because if anything, like I'm the lesser of two evils kind of thing, to where like I'm going to be good to you, where this guy is going to tear you apart if he doesn't get what he wants." And so, like, Sella eventually starts to understand that, and eventually Sella starts to be onto the side of Christopher and really just kind of cementing this relationship if they weren't before. So, yeah, I think that that is the most interesting part of this movie, and I think that I wanted to leave off at that because I don't think I remember anything else. Little bits and pieces here, a ton of little bits and pieces about this movie. But with that said, I am going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.